Hello and welcome everybody to another edition, excuse me, of the Saturdays for the Byzantines podcast. My name is Professor Wren. I'm your host. And today we're going to be talking about the beginning of the end of the Byzantine Empire. Now, it's a long end. It's very drawn out, very dramatic. But I would say that the topic we are discussing here today is the first step in many steps of the end of the Byzantine Empire. And by the time I get to the end of the episode, you will see why. I do apologize that my voice probably sounds a little different, probably sound a little more nasally. I've been battling a little cold here this past week, so I may maybe some pauses where I mute my microphone here in order to blow my nose. I think I joked to a friend of mine earlier today that I was going to go through a box of tissues just this weekend, but looking at the box of tissues, it's right next to me here right now, may not even get me through tomorrow. So hopefully that turns out for us all right. If you're finding this video on YouTube, please make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you are new, and hit the notification bell so that you never miss another episode. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Play, please make sure to give us a follow, and then as well a 5-star review. So getting into it here now, we're going to be talking mainly about the Emperor Heraclius, who we left off talking about in our last episode, where Heraclius usurps, takes over the Byzantine throne from the previous usurper, who was Phocas, who had overthrown the Emperor Maurice after he, for a second time, cut soldiers' pay. Basically, there was a mutiny among one of the Byzantine armies at that point in time. They marched on the capital, Constantinople, and deposed Maurice. Now, Phocas did not last very long because, as a usurper, he was viewed as illegitimate. And so very quickly he was overthrown as well by Heraclius. Now, Heraclius was born in 575 in Cappadocia, though he's an ethnic Armenian. And his reign lasted from about 610 until 641 at his death. Now, his father, who was also named Heraclius, served as a general under Maurice, and for his service he was appointed the Exarch of North Africa. Now, I mentioned this in the previous episode, but if you have missed it, first of all, I'd recommend that you go check it out. But an exarch, the Byzantines at this point in time, especially with the western provinces, which were recaptured by Justinian, an exarch is someone who is essentially appointed. They have both military and civil authority in a particular region, and they have a good deal of autonomy. The Byzantines started using exarchates, especially in the West, so that the workload of administering those provinces was greatly reduced for the government in Constantinople, because at this point in time, they are a bit overstretched. And so if you can take some things off the plate of the government in Constantinople, certainly is going to be of benefit. Now, Heraclius' father, first, from his position as Exarch of North Africa, he sent his nephew, Nicetas, marched overland across Africa to Egypt on a mission to depose Phocas. Then after that, Nicetas does have some success here against Phocas in terms of battling. And there we go. There's the first of our several pauses. I had to sneeze there. Anyway, where were we? But so after Nicetas marches overland and starts fighting with focus in Egypt, Heraclius the Younger is sent with the fleet to Constantinople to finish the job, and he overthrows Focus, and he names himself the new Byzantine emperor. However, Heraclius is going to have the same problem that Focus had to contend with, namely that he was a usurper. He didn't really have a legitimate claim to the Byzantine throne, although granted, his claim was about as legitimate as anyone else who was around at that point in time. Not being the heir to an emperor who dies of natural causes, mostly what we're talking about here. Another issue, this is not just an issue internally in the Byzantine Empire for Heraclius, it's also an issue externally, because the Persian king Khusrau, who we talked about in our last lecture, also does not recognize Heraclius as the legitimate ruler of the Byzantine Empire, and he uses this as an excuse to invade the empire in 611. Now, keep in mind that the Byzantines just had kind of procured a little bit of a peace here, although there's still a lot of chaos going on between territory changing hands, and the Persians had just invaded, and things are in a very precarious situation, which is about to be. The Persians are really going to push them over the edge here. So the Persian army surges through Syria, and they end up taking the city of Antioch, which is really catastrophic for the Byzantines here for a number of reasons. One, Antioch it's a patriarchal see. It is one of the biggest cities in the Eastern Empire. It's one of the wealthiest cities in the Eastern Empire. It's a center of trade, and as well, it also cuts the empire in half, right? Anatolia and Greece and the Balkan provinces are now cut off from Palestine, and Egypt and Syria at this point is essentially lost. Now, Heraclius is going to try to rally here to attack the Persians near Antioch, but he's driven back. And from there, after Heraclius is driven back, he kind of has to do a tactical retreat into Anatolia, which is easily defensible because it's very mountainous, especially Eastern Anatolia is very mountainous, and so you can easily defend it with fortifications and mountain passes. This is why the Byzantines were able to hold on to it for such a long time, moving into the future. But the Persians moved south into Palestine. They conquered Jerusalem, and they removed the true cross from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, for maybe those of you who don't know, is a church that is built over the site where Jesus was buried and resurrected. If you want, you can go. There's a really good documentary done by History. I believe it was done by History Channel a number of years ago at this point. But it features an archaeological couple, the Biddles, who I believe are from Oxford. And the Biddles do an archaeological examination of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and I don't believe either of them are religious. It does seem to be that at least I'm under the impression that the Biddles are irreligious, atheist, agnostic, something along those lines. But they come to the conclusion that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was indeed built over the site where Jesus was buried. And the true cross is just, it's a relic that people believe, and seems to be the case, that it is the cross that Jesus was crucified on. And now, as the Persians wrap up in Palestine, they also then move on to Egypt. And by 620, the Byzantines had lost about half their empire, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. 620 is when the Persians' campaign in Egypt starts wrapping up. Not to mention, these are the most prosperous parts of the empire. Again, all the big population centers, you've lost 3 patriarchal sees at this point. The 5 were Rome, obviously where the Pope is, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. And now Jerusalem, Alexandria, and Antioch are now lost. Those are also some of the wealthiest cities in the Byzantine Empire, Eastern Roman Empire, and as well some of the largest population centers. So this is a very big deal. The empire has been halved, basically. Now, Heraclius at this point has to make some pretty serious decisions. He has to make some really tough decisions. And so one of the things that he does is he has to half the pay of soldiers and civil servants. Now, as we talked about before, and I was very critical of the Emperor Maurice for cutting the pay of soldiers. But the thing was that, half of Maurice had not lost half his empire, and as a result, a significant portion of revenue. He was just kind of looking to save a few dollars and cut some corners. It seems like Heraclius is in a very different situation, and the soldiers seem to have realized that the severity of the situation they were in, because they embrace the sacrifice. The soldiers do not mutiny as a result of their pay being cut. If anything, they really start to rally at this point in time because they recognize that the situation is so dire. Now, Heraclius, as I said, he basically organizes a tactical retreat into Anatolia, and from there, he's going to set out on his campaign to fight back against the Persians and to retake the portions of the empire that he has just lost. Again, I do apologize for the breaks here in the recording. This cold, I was just sick like not that long ago. Those of you who listen consistently, you probably remember I was sick maybe 4 or 6 weeks ago. And granted, when you work as a teacher, you work in schools, and it's inevitable that you're going to get sick from time to time. But it wasn't that long ago that I was sick before. Emperor Atlantis, by the way, I have tried your suggestion of ginger tea. Not my favorite. Not the best tasting. I'm more of a coffee guy, but I do think it definitely, when I started drinking it, the sore throat that I had a couple days ago went away. So thanks for that. I do appreciate that. Shout out to Emperor Atlantis, excellent subscriber. Now, though things are dire, Heraclius still manages to assemble a pretty big army, estimated about 50,000 men. And he's about to go up. He marches through eastern Anatolia, and he's going to attack the Persians. And the best Persian general, the best general the Persians have available, his name is Sharvaraz. He's in eastern Anatolia at the time, and this is going to be the first battle in this kind of phase of the war between the Byzantines and the Persians. Although there's God knows how many wars between the Byzantines and the Persians, but the Byzantines do win this battle. And although it's not a crushing victory, it was the first win that the Byzantines had in quite a while. So it does provide a significant morale boost to the army. The Byzantines have really been kind of kicked down and basically curb stomped here for a couple of years, and especially for people who's pretty accustomed to having lots of victories. Certainly, I would imagine if you're in the Byzantine army, you're feeling a little discouraged, and so to get a win here in this first kind of resurgence of your campaign definitely has to make you feel pretty good. Now, coming off the back of the success, Heraclius wanted to move right into Persian territory and kind of strike right. The Persians just struck at my homeland. I'm going to strike at your homeland. So by marching through Armenia, Heraclius attacks the Persians in Atropatene. This is modern Azerbaijan, and it also would have been basically the homeland of Cyrus the Great. Him being a Mede. Well, I looked this up when I was teaching our kids ancient Persia. It seems that some people dispute the fact that Cyrus is a Mede or was a Mede. That I was always taught that Cyrus was a Mede. Leave in the comments if you know anything otherwise to that. But I find the significance here that this for the Persians, this is kind of where all of their greatness got started with Cyrus. Now, the Persian king, Khosrau, again, he assembles a massive army here to fight back against the Byzantines although the Byzantines do beat them back, and he basically, Heraclius basically runs Khosrau's army out of Atropatene. And in the following year, the Persians come back. Basically, what happened here was there's the one battle where Heraclius defeats the Persian army, and then it's basically wintertime. The campaign season is over. Heraclius goes back to winter in friendly territory, and then he comes back in 625. Khosrau and the Persians come back with actually a bigger army, but Heraclius defeats them again. He actually defeats them several times. Now, the year after that, 626, the Persians form an alliance with the Avars. Now, the Avars, I think I've mentioned this before, but if you're just joining us, the Avars are a group of Central Asian, one of these many groups that come, Turkic groups that come out of Central Asia, nomadic raiders who come on down and give the Byzantines and other groups in Europe a hard time here. Now, and as I said, the Avars are going to form an alliance with the Persians, and they're going to attempt a joint attack on Constantinople. Now, the Persian general Sharvaraz, again, main Persian general here, the best they have to offer, he cleverly ends around Heraclius' army and gets behind them and starts marching across Anatolia towards Constantinople, and he reaches the Bosphorus, and he's basically on the Asian Treadgold here. And again, I'm using Warren Treadgold's Concise History of Byzantium for most of this. Treadgold says that the Persians reached the Asian suburbs of Constantinople. And then the Avars, along with the Slavs, and I should note here that the Avars are essentially ruling over the Slavs at this point in time, so they're combining their forces. They invade by crossing the Danube and marching through Thrace, and so you have the Avars and the Slavs on the European side of Constantinople, and the Persians on the Asian side of Constantinople. Now, fortunately, the Avars and the Slavs did not have the means to overcome the Theodosian walls. That really nobody does up until the Ottomans in 1453. And what the Avars and the Slavs try to do is they try to ferry the Persians across the Bosphorus onto the European side. Treadgold says they use canoes, which just sounds like a terrible idea. The Byzantine Navy is going to come around and foil this pretty easily. And now, but what ultimately saves the day for the Byzantines is that they intercept a message from the king of Persia, Khosrau, that he wants to have Sharvaraz executed. Now, the Byzantines, with this intercepted message, bring it to Sharvaraz, basically tip him off about the danger that he's in. And Sharvaraz, understandably in disgust, withdraws his army. And basically from this point on is not even going to take orders from the Persian king. And I mean, who can blame him, right? He's the best general that the Persians have. He's going out and he's doing the best he can, attacking the Byzantines where it matters the most. And the thanks he gets from his king is, well, I'm going to have you executed. Not exactly the nicest thank you gift he could have gotten. And at this point, the Avars also go home as well because they realize they don't have the means to take Constantinople without the help of the Persians here. As we move along here. Now in 627, Heraclius comes back at the Persians yet again, And the army is said to, Treadgold says that the Byzantine army at this point in time is 70,000, this is combined Byzantine soldiers plus allied troops and mercenaries as well. But still, 70,000, that's a large army, especially considering that the Byzantine Empire has basically been cut in two. And this time in 627, Heraclius is going to make for the real center of the Persian Empire, which is Mesopotamia. Now, this is Khusrau's kind of last stand here, and it comes near the ruins of the old town of Nineveh, like from the Bible, like where God told Jonah to go in the Bible. And by 628, the following year, the Byzantines are threatening Ctesiphon or Ctesiphon, I've heard it pronounced both ways, the capital, which is really the capital of the Persian Empire. Ctesiphon is not too far off from where ancient Babylon would have been. And I actually think it's not too far. I believe it's not too far from Baghdad, modern Baghdad as well. But by this point, Khusrau is completely surrounded. He has no chance, but he still doesn't want to surrender. He refuses to even come to the negotiating table. And so for his hard-headedness, he was deposed and killed by his own son, Kavad II. Now, Kavad comes to the negotiating table with the Byzantines. He sues for peace, and in exchange for ending the war, Kavad offers to free all the prisoners who were captured by the Persians during the war. Now, though this is not great terms, Heraclius still accepts the peace deal anyway, because you need this war to end because it's very expensive. You still don't have, half of your empire, and you need to cut your losses somewhere. Now, fortunately for the Byzantines, in 630, they had an opportunity to back the old general Sharvaraz. He makes an attempt to seize the throne. The Byzantines back him, and he does indeed get himself on the throne. And in exchange for that, in exchange for the Byzantine support, Sharvaraz returns Syria, Palestine, and Egypt to the Byzantines, as well as giving them back the True Cross, which is brought back to Jerusalem. Now, unfortunately for Sharvaraz, he was assassinated 2 months after taking the throne, so it's a pretty good deal for the Byzantines, right? You support a guy to get him on the throne, he gives you back half your empire, and then you don't even need to deal with him because he's dead 2 months later. And the pre-war borders are restored, and as I said, the True Cross is returned to Jerusalem. So really, it's quite an astounding accomplishment here by Heraclius. That he inherits his empire. He comes into the Byzantine Empire, first of all, not being recognized by anyone, basically being viewed as illegitimate, inherits a fairly unstable situation, loses half of his empire within the span of a couple of years. I mean, the campaign we talked about here earlier was not a long campaign. I mean, I'm going to go back and check the years here for a second, but basically by 620, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt are lost, and he comes to the throne in 610. So within a decade, he loses half of his empire. Basically, and the most important part of his empire as well. Again, in terms of financially, it's the most profitable. There's the most people there. There's patriarchal sees, all of these things, and he's able to come back from it. He's able to, and not just that, but the Persian Empire at this point, the Sassanid dynasty is finished. When the Muslims invade, the Persia puts up basically no fight against the Arab Muslims at all. I mean, the Byzantines, though, granted, I'm not exactly spoiling anything here. This happened, hundreds of years ago. The Byzantines will lose half their empire to the Arab Muslims, but they're going to hold out for another. This is about 650. So let's see, to 1,000, 700. That's 300 to 1,400. So that makes 700. So basically another 800 years, the Byzantines are going to hold out their fight against well, for a while, the Arab Muslims, and then as time goes on, it'll be more of the Turkish Muslims. But regardless, the Persia puts up no such fight at all. So it's still very impressive, although very sad. We're definitely entering the sad part of Byzantine history. Although there are some high points for the most part. From here on out, we're going to be talking about a lot of low points for Byzantine history. Our next lecture, by the way, we are going to divert from talking purely about Byzantines. We're going to have to do a lecture on the beginnings of Islam, which you really, I don't see how you avoid addressing that subject in a lecture series like this. But so it sounds like here this should be really a happy ending for Heraclius. He conquers back half of the empire, but major problems still exist. Churches, for example, had fallen into disarray under the rule of the Persians, because now you have basically a whole generation of people who have come up without sacraments, or even just adults. People had not received sacraments for a very long time, because churches are, especially in these, I guess you could call them late antique, or I don't know what time period, these aren't really early Middle Ages, but whatever time period we're talking about, churches are going to need to be repaired fairly frequently, and repairs were not allowed to be made on churches while the Persians were in control here. And as churches become damaged and roofs are, cracking, people aren't going to want to go in there because it's not safe. And so you end up in situations where people go a very long time without having sacraments. Their children are not, being brought up with sacraments. And so this is a gap that when the Byzantines are coming back in, and you have people ruling who are accustomed to all of these things and are expecting all of these things, and they're ruling over people who have not experienced it in quite a while, it's a gap. There's a gap. I'm sorry, I can't think of a better word for it, but there's this gap between the Byzantines who are coming back to rule and the people who are there ruling over. People are also not accustomed to living under Byzantine governance. They spent at least the past decade, really 2 decades, it's about 2 decades living under Persian governance. So that's another disconnect that people have with the upcoming generation, or even just what people have become accustomed to, and the new Byzantine leaders. So Heraclius basically has to re-Romanize all of these areas against Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. And in doing so, he ended the old system of the dominant, which was the provincial administrative system, which was set up by Diocletian and really upheld and enforced by Constantine, and the Romans had been using it ever since then. That goes back to the late 200s. Sorry, I had to sneeze there again. It's not your headphones haven't cut out, or your speakers are still working. That's on my end, guys. But so, like I said, Heraclius has to attempt to re-Romanize these areas. They phase out the dominant, and instead they're going to install exarchs, as I mentioned earlier, like the exarchates, how Heraclius' father was the exarch of North Africa. Now you're also going to have exarchates in all of these traditional regions of the Byzantine Empire, again, to kind of take some of the burden off Constantinople for governing these areas and trying to re-Romanize them. But another issue that Heraclius has to deal with right now is that the empire is broke. Assembling a 70,000 man army is quite impressive, but it costs a lot of money. Even though he had significantly decreased the salary of the soldiers, Heraclius did not have the money to do that. Heraclius actually had to take out a loan from the Patriarch of Constantinople, whereby he melted down a bunch of the gold from the churches in Constantinople in the promise that he would pay back the gold to the churches in Constantinople for maintaining his army. And Heraclius does pay back this loan, but that's a lot of money. And there's just no way to go. There's no two ways about it. That was a lot of money, and sure, it's great that he repaid it, but when you're having to repay a giant debt like that, that's a lot of money that you're not using in other areas. And so any sort of stability here was very short-lived, unfortunately, for Heraclius. This is why I said at the end of the last episode that he's really a tragic hero, in my opinion, because he's heroic in the sense that obviously he's put in this terrible situation. He loses half of his empire. It looks like he's on the verge of collapse, but he comes back. He snatches victory from the jaws of defeat, whatever expression you want to use, but really he has this very, very impressive comeback. And so you want him to kind of ride off happily into the sunset, but that's not what happens. So in the year 633, which is about a year after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, the Arabs storm into Byzantine territory with a vengeance. I mean, they are the tenaciousness. Tenaciousness is not a word. The tenacity with which the Arabs invade both Persia and the Byzantines is extraordinary. In the expansion here in the 600s that you see from Islam. And so first they invade Palestine, and then soon after that, the Byzantines face them in Syria. And we get the infamous Battle of the Yarmouk River, which was just a complete disaster here for the Byzantines. There's a number of issues. For one, the Byzantine army is being led by 4 or 5 generals who do not get along, and they're sending conflicting messages to the troops. They got some bad intel. They set up in this Yarmouk old riverbed, which was a bad place to set up for the battle. And a confluence of all these bad things lead to an absolutely catastrophic defeat for the Byzantine army. And Treadgold mentions that a large portion of the Byzantine army was actually run off cliff into the gorge, which was down further down into the Yarmouk River. But it's not really a river necessarily. It's an old river. From what I remember learning about this in Byzantine history class, it was a dried out riverbed. But now there's nothing stopping the Arabs from running through Syria and Palestine and Egypt. And by the start of the next decade, in the start of about 640, all 3 of these areas are permanently lost to the Byzantine Empire. There's no hope of reconquering this. I mean, Heraclius put forth so much effort, so much money, so much time into reconquering these areas in the first place that it's such a gut punch that within not even 10 years, he basically loses it all again. After having spent all that much money, after having spent that much manpower, assembling those armies, there's just it's like an indescribable. It would be like if your house burnt down, you rebuilt the house, and then the house you rebuilt caught fire and burnt down. I mean, at that point, you're just like, yeah, fine, I'll live in a cardboard box, because that's just the luck that I have right now, right? And so this is the first domino that falls in again, centuries long. We still have 800 years of Byzantine history left to cover, so not like we're right around the corner from the end. But this is the first domino to fall in a centuries long conflict between Byzantine Byzantines and Muslims, whether they're Arab Muslims or Turkish Muslims who will come in later on, which will eventually lead to the fall of the Byzantine Empire. It's a long, slow, painful, tragic death that the Byzantines have coming here for them. But there, like I said, there are still some good times coming up. The Byzantines will have some resurgences. They will have some successes against the Muslims. They will have some failures against the Muslims. We'll be here to cover them all. Like I said, next lecture is going to be on the origins of Islam. We'll talk about the Prophet Muhammad. We'll talk about some of basic tenets of Islam, like the 5 pillars, and some of the early history leading up to the wars they have with the Byzantines here. But again, apologies for kind of a lack of, I understand that I'm not quite as energetic today as I usually am. And I do apologize for the pauses there so you don't have to hear my sneezing and sniffling. Hopefully I get over this cold in the next couple days here, or at least by Monday, so I can go back and teach. But if you've made it this far in the video, thank you so much. Really do appreciate it. Please make sure to share this with your friends, classmates, professors, teachers, family, anyone who you think might be interested or might not be interested. You know, maybe we'll spark their interest. Please make sure to give this video a like, subscribe to the channel if you're new, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another episode. And then as well, please make sure to, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or any other podcast platforms, please make sure to give us a follow. And if you can, if it's available on your particular app, make sure to leave a 5-star review. So that's all I have for you guys today, and I'll see y'all next time.